And welcome to everyone that's joining us today. We're just going to take a few minutes to let the last few people into the meeting, and we'll get started at about 1:10. Oh, sorry, not 10 past, 2 minutes past. Got a couple more people in the waiting room, and then we will get started. So, pnawn da pawb, Elisa dwi, swyddog cyfathrebu yn y Canolfan Gwasanaethau Cyhoeddus Digidol, a croeso i'r cinio dysgu ni sut i ofyn cwestiynau cywir i'r defnyddiwr. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elise. I'm a Communications Officer at Centre for Digital Public Services, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn session on how to ask users the right questions. So this is going to be our last session in our summer series of Lunch and Learns, and we hope you're all going to leave this afternoon with a better understanding and some tips for applying what you've learnt today. So just want to note for everyone, we're going to be recording the session and then sharing this on our YouTube channel. So please turn off your cameras if you don't want to be seen. So every one of these Lunch and Learns is 30 minutes in length, and we really do encourage you to please turn off any distractions and focus on the session where you can. So this is just a quick reminder of all the previous sessions that have been in this Lunch and Learn series. So we've had our first session on how to turn user research data into valuable insights, how to run a workshop to map your service, and how to do pair and trio writing. If you've missed any of these sessions and you'd like to catch up, you can find them all on our YouTube channel. My colleague Alaw is going to be posting a link to that in the chat now. Diolch, Alaw. And I'm going to pass you on to the brilliant duo that are going to be delivering today's session, Yana Blake-Walker and Gabby Mitcham-Evans. Thank you, diolch.
Thanks, Elise. Hi, everyone. So my name's Gabby. I'm a senior user researcher at CDPS.
Thanks, Gab, and I'm Yana. I'm also a user researcher at CDPS as well. Hi.
We're really excited to speak to you today about something we're really passionate about. So as Elise has touched on already, today we're going to be talking about how to ask users the right questions. So today we're going to start by touching on what user interviews actually are. So some of you might be aware of this already, but just in case anybody isn't, we'll touch on that. We're also going to touch on how you can check you're researching the right topic to begin with, why it's important to ask the right questions, and also principles of good and bad question design. We've then also got a little activity at the end and a recap just to make sure that you're taking something really practical away from today. So before we get stuck into the presentation, we just wanted to take a minute to check who has done user interviews before. So if you wouldn't mind, we're just going to take a minute to see a show of hands if you have undertaken one before. There should be a raised hand function on Zoom, so there's a reactions button at the bottom of your screen. Although if you're finding that difficult, please just pop a yes in the chat. It's also absolutely fine if you haven't ever done a user interview before. We've tailored this session so that it will be helpful for anybody, whether you have or not. I'm not actually able to see any.
I can't see them
because we're on spotlight mode. So perhaps if Elise or Alaw, if you can help us see whether anyone's putting their hands up or not. Oh, I can see it now. I've just opened it.
Useful. Sorry, Gab.
There's always some technical issues, isn't there? Cool. So I can see a few of you have put up your hands. So we were expecting probably a mixture, so that's absolutely fine and probably what we expected. And we just wanted to check to make sure we're tailoring it to what you need to find out. So that's great. Thank you. Next slide, please, Elise. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to start off by just touching on what user interviews are. So it might be quite obvious to some, but essentially interviews are all about a one-to-one conversation between a researcher and a user. This might also include an observer to note take sometimes, but generally you really want that one-to-one element so that you can make space for quite an intimate conversation to really drill down into a specific intimate conversation. And they're designed to allow the user to share stories about relevant experiences. And as you can see by this Nielsen-Norman group illustration in the middle, you've got kind of the two layers there, and what interviews really allow you to do is go further than just attitudes and preferences of users and really dig down into the norms, values and beliefs that users have. So what we're looking at here is really trying to gain a deeper understanding beyond surveys or KPI data and really understand that deeper insight that users will have. And what we'll be aiming to do there is provide the why behind the what. So if you imagine with a survey, you might be able to learn that 20% of users think this, but what you won't understand is that why. So that's why we would look to do user interviews to really understand that. Next slide, please. And what you can learn from interviews is really quite varied, depending on what you would like to learn from it. But these are just some of the things that you might be able to learn from an interview. So you might be able to learn about user needs and pain points, so any problems that your users are having or ideas about solutions that might help them. You might also be able to learn about their values, motivations and desires. So we've touched on that a little bit already, but really understanding what's important to your users. Also about language. So anybody who works in public sector like us will probably be aware that there's two sides to language. There's probably our internal speak and the acronyms we use. And then there's user-facing language as well. And by speaking to people in interviews, you really be able to mirror that language that they use rather than the language that we use. And then lastly, there's also narratives. So you'll really be able to understand the longer term picture of your users' needs. Okay, so I'm going to move us on now to talk about how we can check your research in the right topic. So this might sound a bit strange, but it's really important that you understand why you're conducting user interviews and what you want to find out or learn from your users. And I think it can be really easy to say yes to your stakeholders when they ask you for a piece of research, but as the person doing the research, it's really important that we understand why we're conducting it. And I think if you start off by really challenging what you're trying to learn, you'll make sure that your research is not biased and focused on the right thing. So what we'd recommend is really getting together with your team to understand and agree your research questions and scope before you begin. And when we talk about research questions, we're talking about the bigger picture questions that will drive your entire research. And they're different to the questions that you ask users. And I know Jana's going to touch on that a little bit later. And what we always recommend is that your scope should be clear and focus on solving a problem for a user. And without that, you could end up biasing what you learn and designing something that's not fit for purpose. And here I've just popped 3 questions that can really help you to make sure that you're not biased in your research and you're giving yourself the best chance to set up your research for success. So the first one is around thinking about, are we solving a business problem rather than a user problem? So this is something you might want to ask your team as well. So typically, we as the people who are working on the problem might have a really good understanding of the business problem, but we might have less of an idea about the user problem. So I'd always recommend making sure that you understand both of those sides. And potentially if it's just a business problem that's driving your research, then potentially you might want to pause and understand what that looks like on the user side. The second one is around assumptions. So typically when we enter a piece of research, we all have our own biases and assumptions that make us approach research in different ways. But it's really important that we kind of take a second to understand what those assumptions are. So what I mean by this is you might enter research, and because you're so close to the subject matter, you might be guessing actually about what users think or need. So it's really important that you kind of acknowledge what those assumptions are. And then lastly, do we have a solution in mind? So this is something that I've seen time and time again. So a stakeholder might ask you for a piece of research to help them understand what or how an app or how a platform might work. However, what we really need to do is strip that back to the problems that people have to make sure that the solution is the right one, and we're not just guessing about what that right solution should be. And then also, you know, if the answer is yes to any of these questions, then it doesn't mean you're completely wrong, but it does mean that you might need a bit more time to think about those things before you speak to users. If you speak to users before you've ironed out some of those things, then you could end up biasing your research and not giving it the best chance to succeed or give you the right answers. So in this scenario, I'd really recommend just pausing and working with your team to make sure that your scope is user focused, and then you're going to set yourself up for success. So I'm going to pass over to Jana now to cover why it's important to ask the right questions.
Great, thanks, Gab. So we've established then you've worked with your team, and you know that you've got some research questions and you've decided that user interviews are what you want to do. Great. But you might feel that doing user interviews is just conversational and it's just simple and straightforward. And sometimes it can be, but there is more to a good interview than people sometimes realize. So this next section is going to be talking to you about those sort of how to ask the right questions and that sort of part of it. But essentially, if you're doing user interviews and you're asking the wrong questions, and you might end up digging in the wrong place. So I've likened it to an archaeologist digging in the wrong place. So it's, for example, if you're digging in the wrong place, you are going to be losing sight of what those discoveries and what those long buried insights are. And you could just be digging at an empty hole. So those carefully crafted interview questions is an important part to make sure that you're digging in the right place. The questions you ask in user interviews, they determine the quality of the data we gather. High quality questions, they give you high quality data, and they help you uncover some more meaningful and deep insights. And then poorly crafted questions can lead to vague or misleading or maybe even irrelevant responses that aren't going to answer those research questions. So question construction is a really, really important part to your user interviews. It's important to make sure that you get unbiased, accurate and relevant information from your users. And there are a few things to be aware of when writing your questions, because they're tools essentially to understand cover those user insights. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the principles of good and bad question design now. So tip 1. Don't ask users what they want. You may have heard this before, but it definitely is a battle cry of us user researchers. Do not ask them what they want. That won't give you the true meaning behind why they behave the way they do or what they really need. So Erica Hall states, she's written a book, Just Enough Research. I highly recommend you reading it if you wanted to have a dabble at research. But yeah, the first rule, never ask anyone what they want. Asking people what they want will lead you to the wrong insight. You won't uncover the root cause of the problem, but rather what those users envision as their own ideal solution. And one of my favorite quotes is Henry Ford, where he allegedly said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And this is one of my most favorite quotes to use when we're talking about user research. Uncovering user needs is simply more than asking people's opinions. I think if you asked people back then what they would have wanted or what would have made it easier for them, they probably would have replied a faster horse a more comfortable horse to ride, a horse that obeys my orders, and perhaps one that doesn't kick me. But instead, Henry Ford came up with a car, which is something users would never have asked for. So next slide, please. So it can be tempting to ask those users what they want, but it won't tell you if it will work in practice. So instead, we should be focusing on finding problems and uncovering the behaviours so that we can understand what's causing their problem to help understand how that solution might help them in their own context. So there's an example of some questions here of, would you like a new appointment booking system? They're going to go, yeah, great, that'd be great. But actually, if you understand what problems they're facing in their role or how they're doing it, you might actually uncover the right solution for them. Next slide, please. So yeah, tip 2 is be aware of leading questions. If you're asking leading questions, you're going to find really biased insights. So staying neutral is key. If you ask leading questions, you're likely to bring your own opinions and biases to the project, but don't let them show. It happens. We all do it, but it's really good to be conscious of those biases to make sure that doesn't come into the way you're asking the questions. So it's always good practice to ask someone else who's got a different viewpoint, a different bias, a different perspective, to look over the questions to see if they can point that out. So an example is, do you find it difficult to find the content on this page? That's really leading that user to say that it's difficult, when they might not find it difficult. Next slide, please. So to counteract that, you can ask more open-ended questions to increase your chance of getting that user to open up a little bit more and give a broader story and a broader conversation from that participant. So likely a good telltale way of that you're asking a leading question or a closed question is, if the answer to your question is yes or no, it's probably a leading or quite a restrictive question. So you could ask them instead, how have you found using the experience of this product? That would give you a little bit more insight into that experience of that user. Tip 3 is one thing at a time. It can be quite tempting when you're in user interviews because you want to find out so much that you ask loads of questions because you're really familiar with what you're researching. But that can often confuse the user when they're being interviewed. So try to keep your questions focused on one thing at a time. When you're asking those multiple questions, you can overwhelm that user and then give them more information than's needed. It's quite weird when you're asked a double-ended question, like, which one am I answering? So an example of double-headed questions here is, how did you find that? Was it clear, and what was you expected? There's different answers to all of those questions. So if to counteract that, if you have more questions to ask on that similar topic, just ask follow-up questions. If your participant has said something interesting in response to one of your questions, follow it up and don't make assumptions as to why they said or did something. So you could have a participant say to you, I've never used a website like this before. Probe a little bit around that and ask, why is that? That will give you a real insight, and you can keep just probing and in a semi-structured way to find out more insight. Tip 4 is a big one, is don't use your research questions as interview questions. They are not the same thing. So like I said, you've identified some good research questions, you've sat down with your team, you know what you want to learn. You can't then just take those questions and ask users those questions, because they won't give you the right insight. So I thought we could do a little bit of an activity. If we could use the chat function here. Research question, we've got a team that fictional team that are looking into recycling. Their research question, what they want to learn is, how much is inconvenience a factor in preventing residents from recycling? You could be tempted to just slightly tweak that into an interview question to what extent is inconvenience a factor in preventing you from recycling? I'd just like to understand from everyone here what they think's wrong with that question and what might happen if you ask that type of question. If anyone's got before, you could just drop whatever you want into the chat and I'll see what comes in. Everyone's got I don't know if you know how to get to the chat. There's a more button at the bottom if you haven't got it. So what would you think if we asked users that question? Yeah, Yeah, Susanna, it is definitely a leading question. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely a leading question, and it's not going to give you that insight. That might be what you want to learn. Yeah, the language as well. Yeah, it's quite wordy. It's not in a layman's way. Yeah. Yeah, great. Picked up on some really good things there. So yeah, that's why you wouldn't ask a research question to a participant in an interview. Go to the next slide. So they're both really important parts of user research, and they work together to accomplish the same goal. So understanding your user needs and pain points, and challenging assumptions and discovering new insights. But those research questions focus on what you want to discover through your entire study. They're those big quick picture questions. And the user interview questions are those exact questions that researchers ask participants during this study. Sometimes if you ask a research question, that's completely unanswerable to a user if you pose them directly, especially if they're about motivation or sensitive topics such as around health and money. And you also can't ask people to predict their behaviours or to remember something that was too far in the past. No one can tell you how likely they are to do anything in the future, because humans are way better at making up answers than remembering them accurately. So what you might do with a research question like this, so you want to know whether inconvenience is a factor in preventing residents from recycling. The type of interview questions you can ask are, can you describe your current recycling practices at home? That'll give you a bit more understanding into their current behaviours. What challenges, if any, do you face when you try to recycle, which will identify barriers? And what kinds of resources or information, if any, do you feel you need to recycle more effectively? So that will help understand any needs that they may have. You can also explore what incentives, so what would motivate you to recycle more as well. So that might help understand what would incentivize people to recycle more. You can see that each interview question is a little bit more specific and focused, but it is directly linked to that broad research question. So they're designed to elicit detailed responses from users in regards to that overarching research question and provide actionable insights from that. Next slide, please. So to give you a bit of a summary, there's lots more to user interviews, and we would love to talk to you a little bit more about all the other things that are involved in user interviews, not to mention consent and creating sort of guides and things like that as well, so, which we can help you with. But essentially, asking the right questions is a good place to start, and that's really crucial to gathering that useful insight. And to really make things user-centered, we need to take that time to construct questions with careful considerations. So we need to make sure that they are unbiased and they're clear, they're not double-ended, they're open-ended rather than closed. And that will help you then uncover those profound insights and drive those user-centric designs for services. And like I said, research questions and interview questions, while they're related, they are distinct roles in terms of processing, in terms of process of conducting user research. But that said, user research is as much of an art as it is a science. It's not just about asking those well-crafted questions. We need to master how to actively listen and then respond, and guide those conversations in different directions based on what's being said, but also maintaining that focus ensures that your insights then are relevant. So there is much more to this, and you also need to make sure that it's safe and inclusive, and that you include informed consent for your participants. But that's a whole other session. But we've got loads of resources on our website to support you with your user research. And really the message both Gabby and I want to say is some user research or even imperfect research is better than nothing at all. So just roll your sleeves up and get your hands dirty, but do it in that sort of safe space. Practice doing sort of less risky research, maybe testing some of your websites, maybe asking users about their experiences of your call centers or your help desks. User interviews are one of the most personal research methods that you can do, and despite its intent, they can always be conversational. So don't worry about them being really, really professional. you've got to warm your users up to interviews. We often call them conversations rather than interviews as well, because that can sometimes sort of warm users up to taking part. But it's never a failure if you ask a leading question or you fall victim to those bad design. We all do it, and it's practice makes perfect. But just recognize it when it happens and be conscious of it for your next interview. But you can practice and you can seek that feedback from peers, and we've got a user research community that you can join, where if you've got any questions about conducting interviews with users or you're not sure, come and join our community and ask us. There's lots of different user researchers in there in different roles, different levels of experience that can help you with that. Or if you want, come and take part in real user research and see how it happens. We're just starting up a panel to contact users for research that we're doing in CDPS, and that might be a good way for you to see how a user interview is run, and how sometimes we get it wrong as well, you know. So it'll be good if you could join either one of those communities or that panel, and we'll send some links out at the end of the session for that. If you've got any questions, yeah, here's our details. Hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Jana and Gabby. So we've had a couple of questions in the chat. My colleague Ala will be sending over the links in a second, just on joining that user research community of practice. I know we've also had a question from Rebecca about sharing the slides. We will be sending those out with all the other resources that we've talked about in the session today, as a follow-up. And yeah, if you have any questions now, if you'd like to come off camera or come off mute and ask Jana and Gabby, you're more than welcome. You're welcome to pop any in the chat also. I'll just give everyone a moment. We've just had a question now that's come through, Jana or Gabby. I don't know if you want to take this from Simon about preparing follow-ups or prompts.
Jana, do you want to, or do you want me to?
You can answer that one if you want.
Yeah, sure. So we don't have specific advice on that particularly, Simon, but I think like Jana said, once you've got that clear research question, you can then drill down into the specific things you want to learn in order to answer that research question. And again, that's something you could do as a team to maybe brainstorm. I know I start off having really rubbish questions or just bullet points that I want to learn about, and then I'll reframe that into a question. So like Jana said, it doesn't have to be perfect first time, but just start broad and then whittle those down into a succinct amount of questions, because obviously you don't want to overwhelm people asking too much either. But that would probably be my advice on that.
Yeah, agreed. And sometimes those prompts just come organically when you're having that conversation, as long as you keep that research question in mind, because you could go off on different tangents. Keeping that research question in mind, sometimes those prompts will just come out naturally in terms of the conversation that you're having with the user.
Definitely.
Thanks, Gabby and Jana. So I think that's it in the chat for now. And yeah, please get in touch on the email addresses on the screen. It'd be really great to have some feedback on today's lunch and learn session. So we've set up a survey over on menti.com. You can access that by scanning the QR code on screen with your mobile, or by heading over to menti.com and entering the code 84277825. So we'll just be asking you, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statements? The lunch and learn made sense to me. I learned something new today. I would like to start trying this technique in my own organisation, or I still have questions. And what is your main takeaway from today's session? I will just give everyone a moment to scan that QR code or follow that link to menti.com. Okay. So just in the interest of time, we've got our mailing list also. So if you'd like to keep in touch and find out more about our next series of Lunch and Learns, I mentioned at the beginning, this last session in our summer series, we're going to be starting up another series in the autumn. If you'd like to find out more about this, sign up to our mailing list. Alau has just popped a link in the chat to do that now. It would be great to see some familiar faces there again in the autumn. And lastly, just a massive diolch yn fawr, thank you to everyone that's come along to today's session, and to Yana and Gabby for their brilliant work today, and also to the UCD team at CDPS for their work on the summer series. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email with all links to useful resources and a recording of the session. And yeah, I hope to see some of you at the autumn Lunch and Learns. We're going to be in touch with further details of those closer to the time. Hwyl fawr pawb, tan tro nesaf. Goodbye until next time. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.